It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Erin Zaleski, Paris correspondent. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Happy to be here.
All right, glad to have you. Glad to welcome back Vivian Walt, Paris contributor to Time magazine. A couple weeks back, your cover story, the interview with Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. We'll be talking about him a little bit later on. Anne-Elisabeth, writer and columnist for the Daily and Sunday Telegraph.
Good evening.
Nice to see you.
Thank you.
And Judith Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. I've been meaning to ask you, where does one find World Politics Review?
It's still at www.worldpoliticsreview.com.
Okay, The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag World This Week. It's been another tumultuous one in Washington, capped by the biggest indictment to date in the Trump-Russia scandal. The Office of Special Counsel Robert Mueller charging the U.S. president's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, of lying to the FBI about his contacts with Russia's ambassador to the United States. And Vivian Walt, Flynn, if you believe reports on both ABC News and the Associated Press, effectively saying that he feels betrayed by Trump. Does that expect that he's got a lot to say to the investigators?
Absolutely. Be careful who you dismiss from your administration. I think that's the lesson. He is somebody who obviously is in possession of very inside information about what went on during the campaign and also during the first few months of the administration, and can really put things in a context that maybe no one else can. And if you remember, several months ago, Trump asking Comey, the fired FBI director, to lay off Flynn, not to investigate Flynn. And there was always a question why. And I think we might well have that question answered.
For people watching outside the United States, is this a breakthrough moment?
I think it's definitely a significant moment. And this is the first person who's actually worked in the Trump White House and who held a significant position who's admitted to breaking the law. The question is, as Vivian was saying, I'm curious as to what the parameters are of this plea deal. The fact that he took a plea deal suggests that he has information to share.
Has information to share, but you also have to wonder, it's the United States, and there's defense attorneys too, how credible a witness will Michael Flynn be?
Well, it was the first thing I mentioned to my editorial team. He's pleading guilty to lying to the FBI, which undermines his credibility as a witness, obviously, because he's admitting that he's prone to lying. I think the reason why it's a very significant development is, as both Vivian and Erin said, this isn't a coffee boy, as Trump dismissed a previous sort of minor foreign policy advisor on the campaign. This isn't someone who was just busy trying to shake up leads with Russia, where the emails were getting lost in the chain or swatted down. This Mike Flynn was one of the first real supporters of Donald Trump, who had at the time, at the very least, something of a real standing in the national security community. He was brought on board to sort of add ballast to Trump's campaign at a time when people were beginning to ask questions about Trump's foreign policy advisory team. And from there, he really won Trump's trust. He wasn't someone who periodically showed up. He wasn't someone like Paul Manafort, who was brought in for a specific task, lasted a few months, but was never really part of Trump's inner circle. He was someone who Trump trusted. He was someone who advised Trump. And he was someone who it would be very hard to argue that something that he did not come from Trump or get cleared by Trump or Trump's very inner circle, because he was part of it. So all of that, the fact also that his plea deal involves a charge of lying to the FBI. There's been reporting that he was conspiring with the Turkish government to kidnap Fethullah Gulen, and the gold trader who's on trial in New York, to return them to Turkey. That means someone who was going to be named the national security advisor to the U.S. president, reportedly, allegedly, was in discussions to kidnap a legal U.S. resident, because Gulen is a legal U.S. resident. So he's pleading guilty to a very minor charge, which means these other heavy charges are still hanging over him, or potential charges, including not reporting income from being an agent for foreign governments. All of this means that he has huge incentives to win the prosecutor's favor, to give all sorts of information that he has, and to be a very, very cooperative witness.
So far, the smoking gun doesn't point at Donald Trump directly, although allegedly, according to Flynn, it does. Elisabeth Moutet, it took 18 months between the time the Watergate scandal broke and Richard Nixon resigned. Trump's got Republican majorities in both houses of Congress. Can you just ride this out?
Well, it was very interesting that Flynn got basically rid of fairly fast. And that's really interesting in itself. I mean, the White House dumped him. And that really meant that they were worried about him from the start. Can he write this out? It depends how long. I mean, I don't know how long he can ride out. I think in the end, either they get to another election. The Watergate started in the first term of Richard Nixon, and then it ended basically to Nixon's resignation in the second term. That is going to follow him.
It's going to follow him. And Trump, again, proving this week how he somehow seems to welcome turmoil. Case in point, his retweets of anti-Muslim videos of an obscure British fringe far-right group, one that's morphed into a full diplomatic row. He had a follow-up tweet. He had to send it twice. The first time it was sent to the wrong Theresa May. He said, "Don't focus on me. Focus on the destructive radical Islamic terrorism that is taking place within the United Kingdom. We're doing just fine!" Exclamation point. That's got the UK government rethinking the timing of a state visit offer to Trump.
But the fact that we work together does not mean that we're afraid to say when we think the United States have got it wrong, and be very clear with them. And I'm very clear that retweeting from Britain First was the wrong thing to do.
And Elisabeth, your newspaper reporting this Friday that that offer of a state visit, it's been put on big-time hold at this particular point in time.
It has, because Theresa May is in an impossible position anyway, even without Donald Trump. I suspect that she answered. She answered specifically Donald Trump, partly because that would make her popular with parts of her electorate. It was very interesting then when Trump retweeted those British fascist tweets, videos. Even hard Brexiteers said this is not what Britain is all about. Britain is about being open. Daniel Hannan, the MEP, retweeted that, and so even her allies were horrified, and so she had to sort of bring people together. The other thing is, at this stage, there have been so many threats in Britain of hard demonstrations against Trump that I think it will fall on her. It will be her fault. And therefore, putting the visit on hold is probably what she has to do best, because otherwise it's going to be a little bit like those protests in 2000 against globalization in Seattle. It's going to be a wave, and it's going to be yet one more sign that she can't hold the country or the government together.
So what do the Americans do? Because they're supposed to inaugurate this new U.S. embassy. Do they just wait and wait and wait?
Do they even have an ambassador? And I haven't checked the last two things, but it's all very well to have an embassy, but I think 2/3 of American ambassadors have still not been named. So I suspect they could wait for a bit.
The thing that surprised me was given the effect that Donald Trump has been like the kiss of death to British far right, to the European far right. Nigel Farage has basically disappeared from the political landscape after being closely associated with him. UK.
Yeah, he won.
Well, except that he criticized Trump yesterday for his tweet.
But either way, I mean, another way to respond would have been, thank you, Donald Trump. We now know that Britain First is going to disappear like all the other people that you've embraced in Europe.
Well, one thing that Trump really has accomplished is some unity in Britain. It's just remarkable. We've never seen such a moment of like unified, condemnation. We haven't seen it in Britain for a long time.
And Vivian and Elisabeth joking about the number of ambassadors that have yet to be named, and we might be soon rid of the current U.S. Secretary of State?
This, to me, is one of the most unsettling things. It's not simply that, we don't have ambassadors. Okay, ambassadors are one thing. But you don't have key assistant secretaries of state for key region, including like people that deal with, you know, the nuclear threat in North Korea. The key career officials are leaving, and the appointed officials have not been named yet. So you have a kind of vacuum that at this point should really kind of scare many people.
It's been a bit musical chairs since the beginning, though. And then we have this Russia scandal on top of it, and that's causing even more of a distraction. So,
and we're still wondering, is it a grand design? Is this Trump's ideology, or is it just, well, the way he works?
Oh, the tweet or the musical
whole
chairs?
Thing,
the whole disaster.
The leaving, you know, seats unoccupied, undermining some of his own cabinet, tweeting.
Well, I mean, I think everybody would agree that the British Rao would speak to this, that the man lacks diplomacy. I mean, and I think that's a reflection of that.
You asked before if he can ride this out. And I think that what we're beginning to see now is that the wheels are starting to come off the carriage. You look around the world, there are all sorts of regions where people who really sort of catered to Trump and thought they had an opportunity with Trump. In the Middle East, they're realizing there's no one home. They have no one to call. The people who they do have to call don't know the slightest thing about the region. There are other parts of the world where there's just no one to call. The people at the desks where they used to have partners or people to clarify, they're not there anymore. And so I think what you'll begin to see is that, especially if the Republicans in Congress have trouble passing this tax reform, I think what you'll begin to see is that as the domestic legislative agenda basically stalls out, and as the wheels start coming off the carriage in the international arena, that people are going to start realizing that actually they thought they might be able to hitch themselves up to Trump's wagon and get somewhere. They're not getting anywhere. At that point, I don't know that he'll be impeached, but he might become almost like the earliest lame duck president that we've ever seen, with Congress trying to take as much initiative as possible, and other international actors doing the same in international affairs.
It's the first day of December, but over in Moscow, it's already next year. The Russian capital hosting the draw for the group phase of next summer's Football World Cup. 32 teams, 8 groups. It'll be a month-long party next June. At the center of it all, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. But it's certainly not the same party as the one that was sold to us back in 2010 when Russia got the cup. Yes, by next spring, the Russian president will have been comfortably re-elected if all goes to script. But after the annexation of Crimea, the post-Sochi Olympic doping scandal, and a deep freeze with the West, some even wondering if this is such a great thing, hosting the World Cup after all for Russia.
It's in the eyes of the Russians, I suspect it is. And that's what really matters to Putin. We say this, but if you speak to anybody who lives in Moscow or has been following Russian news from their side, it is, it's yet another achievement. He still has, he doesn't even have to sort of fiddle with the election. He's going to be re-elected by a majority of Russians who actually want him to be re-elected. So, for us it doesn't look that good, but for the Russians it works fine.
It works fine, Vivian Walt?
Yeah, I mean, luckily for them, the U.S. isn't even in the World Cup next year, so they don't have to have President Trump arriving and deal with all of that. So, sorry. But
there will be a lot of reporters. Now, granted, most of those journalists will be following their own national team and not doing too much snooping.
I think one shadow hanging over this World Cup is the 2022 World Cup in Qatar as well. I mean, both are really a kind of legacy of years of corruption and bribery within FIFA, and both have big question marks hanging over them as to how they've wound up hosting this really mega event.
Yeah, there's all these lofty questions. But of course, once the whistle blows for the first kickoff, people only care about the result.
Depends if you're a football fan or not, I suppose.
I have to confess that the minute people start talking about the nitty-gritty of the World Cup, they speak in tongues as far as I'm concerned, so I'm not going to be very competent.
The advantage for Russia is that their hooligans won't have to travel very far this time.
Exactly.
But they're saying there won't be hooligans, that he'll be able to keep that on a tight leash.
Well, yeah, I guess maybe let me not say anything undiplomatic about the relationship between Russian soccer hooligans and the Russian government. But no, I'll be very honest. To me, there's a lot of the shine has come off a lot of these international sporting events for me. After Brazil, also, when you see the fact that they don't really have the kind of positive economic impact on the countries that host them, international sports, whether it's the corruption or the doping. I hate to be the sort of Scrooge, but to me, there's something not to be too nostalgic about the good old days, because people were doping back then also. But there's just something about these international sporting events, whether it's the Olympics, the World Cup, that just you know what's going on behind the scenes, and it's somewhat unseemly, and so it leaves me a little cold.
Leaves Judah Grunstein a little cold. When we come back, we'll see if
just because the U.S. isn't in the World Cup.
It could be sour grapes, and that the French got a pretty easy draw. So did the English, by the way. When we come back, we'll change continents. Emmanuel Macron's. It's a rite of passage for a French president, that first big tour of Africa. We'll ask our panel how it went, including a feisty exchange with students at a university in Burkina Faso's capital. Stay with us. It's The World This Week.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
On June the 5th, 1967, the Israeli army invaded Egyptian Sinai, unleashing a war that would change the face of the Middle East. During the Six-Day War, Israel took rapid possession of the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Old City of Jerusalem, holy sites for Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. It's a stranglehold that the Israeli authorities have maintained to this day.
The Temple Mount and the Western Wall will forever remain under Israeli sovereignty.
50 years later, East Jerusalem still symbolizes the ascendancy of Israel, whose settlements policy has created tensions which are as strong today as ever and make the atmosphere in Jerusalem unique in the world.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
There are those of us who like to venture to the unexplored. Those of us who go out there with a sense of wonder, bridging worlds, finding delight in our differences. If you are one of us and you want to explore more of this great planet, we're ready to take you there. Widen your world. Turkish Airlines.
Welcome back. Before we resume the World This Week, some of the stories that Tom Burgess-Watson is following for you in the newsroom. Donald Trump's former national security advisor pleads guilty to lying to the FBI over his contacts last December with the Russian ambassador. Michael Flynn says he is cooperating with the special counsel heading the investigation. The World Cup draw in Moscow. France drawn with Australia, Peru, and Denmark. England in the same group as Belgium, Spain in an Iberian derby to take on Portugal, and the group of death, Argentina, Iceland, Croatia, and Nigeria. Kedevan Gorgistani will have more. Turkey's prime minister calls on a Turkish-Iranian gold trader to go back on his mistake. Reza Zarrab's assets back home frozen after he told a federal court in New York that the order to dodge U.S. sanctions against Iran came straight from the office of President Erdogan. And a first executive at Lafarge under formal investigation over the Franco-Swiss cement giant's alleged payment of protection money back in 2013 to radical groups near the plant it was still operating in Syria. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Aaron Zaleski, Paris correspondent. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time Magazine. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, writer and columnist for The Daily and The Sunday Telegraph. And Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. First major tour of Africa for France's 39-year-old president in Burkina Faso, Emmanuel Macron, reminding students at Ouagadougou University that he was born after independence. Macron, fully conscious of that symbiotic relation over the years between Paris and its former colonies. For instance, take the minute where a young student asks whether the inauguration of West Africa's largest solar-powered electric plant on Thursday meant that the air conditioning would be fixed in the hall.
You speak to me as if France was still a colonial power, but I do not want to take care of electricity problems in the universities of Burkina Faso. That's his job. That's the job of the president. So on the other hand, I reassure you. Oh, what's this? He's going away. Stay there. Maybe he's off to repair the air conditioning.
Vivian Walt, what do you think of that exchange?
Phew, where to begin? He clearly missed the mark.
He missed the mark.
I think that's clear. You know, particularly going to Africa, and I was in South Africa just last week, I think that one has to be acutely aware of the tone you adopt in a public forum with the president right next to you. He was casual. He felt like he was among friends, not really that he was the president of their former colonial power. And he played that generation card way too much. It was almost like his youth would excuse him from whatever.
So
France
there should be more deference, Your Excellency, this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. He didn't treat his African counterpart as his counterpart. And I think that was, I think that touched a raw nerve within the hall. And if you read the African press afterwards, they were not kind to Emmanuel Macron.
You're saying they're not kind. First of all, let's hear his own defense. France 24's Roselyne Febvre sat down an exclusive interview with Emmanuel Macron. She asked the French president about the criticism. This in an exclusive interview with Radio France International.
They can be very paternalistic. It's like you can't make a joke when you talk to an African leader. Humor, laughter, is a relation of equals. It shows you can joke between one another. Are there certain things you can't talk about when you come to Africa? Are there certain truths you can't say? That's a part of where things bog down. You have to be able to say things in a dispassionate manner.
He goes on to say, I could tell these kinds of jokes to Jean-Claude Juncker because I have that kind of relationship. I couldn't do it with Angela Merkel. I don't have that kind of relationship with her. Well, what do you think of Emmanuel Macron's defense?
I think it's a clever defence because he's a clever man. I also think that the first half was actually quite, to the point when he says, it is not my job 60 or 70 years after decolonisation to take care of problems that ought to be taken by the state. And then he thought, and that is actually an accusation against what has happened to most African former French colonies after decolonisation and laying it all on the responsibility on the former colonial power lasts for a bit, but he was born after that. So that's an interesting argument. And then I think he thought it would be diffusing it with a sort of impromptu joke, and that didn't work at all. But he was making an actually rather serious point. So it's going to be interesting where things go from there afterwards. But more of the same, you know the definition of madness is sort of doing always the same thing and expecting that you will get different results. And I think we've had Your Excellencies, all over for 50 years, and it has not solved many problems. So why not bring this young man and see what gives?
The thing is about this whole trip is that it's sort of this set piece for the new French president.
Right.
Every new French president has to go to generally West Africa, and they have to reset the relationship. and they have to declare that France-Afrique as
that symbiotic relationship
where
is over.
France kind of manipulates and dominates behind the scenes or in front of the scenes is over.
And is used.
And every time it's done, and it's really it's sort of routine and rote, but its significance emerges when the exercise isn't handled properly. Nicolas Sarkozy famously bungled his first speech in Africa. He offended everyone by essentially saying that Africans hadn't entered history yet.
So did Macron bungle? Because after all, he goes
let me just finish the point.
He visits Burkina Faso, he visits Ghana, two countries that have shown their capacity to rebound from dictatorship.
What's interesting to me is that Barack Obama also went to West Africa. He made not the same speech as Sarkozy. It hit different notes, but the same message, which was 40, 50, 60 years later, colonialization is no longer a justification for African governments that don't keep the air conditioning running in the universities. So I think what Macron was saying was similar in terms of the substance of his remark. His tone was very different, but it's also quite a condemnation of the president sitting next to him, because it's true. If there's no air conditioning in that university, it's the Burkinabe president's failure.
Viv, the French newspaper Libération, one of the articles written by the correspondent who followed the presidential trip, quotes one of the students in the room. Yes, Macron humiliated the Burkinabe president, but he was right.
Well, I think that's correct. I mean, maybe I'm walking back what I said earlier. It was a little shocking to watch the whole exchange, which I did live thanks to France 24. And one of the other things that struck me was his very blunt comment about women having too many babies. You know, a point which really dates back many, many decades, way back to colonial times, which French leaders have always said about Africa. And it was done in a way that was, once again, very correct. Economically, it's not going to work. He made the economic point. He's an economist. But the way it was received was a little bit, I think people were somewhat taken aback by that.
Are you surprised that they were taken aback?
No, not really. I mean, he's arriving as, you know, the proclaimed new face, new tone, new style French leader. So I think anything that smacked of the old style would be a little bit of a jolt to people in the room.
He also kept reiterating the importance of moving forward of partnership between Africa and France. Except he was heavy on words, but I noticed he was light on specifics. And I'm curious as to what that means exactly. What does this new policy encompass when he says cooperation?
Yeah, the other aspect where he made a big announcement was regarding Libya and a creation of a task force after that shocking video that first aired on CNN of a sub-Saharan African slave market in Tripoli, saying there'd be a task force talking about sending some kind of peacekeepers or police or something, and that's a little bit been rolled back since. Right.
There was that, and I think pretty sure it was Libya earlier, that he wanted to set up migrant processing centers in Libya. So it's not the first time that he's sort of spoken of this plan that it ended up falling flat and nothing came of it.
Well, there's something else, which is that, again, the European Union isn't responsible for slave markets in Libya, but they are responsible for a deal with the Libyan government and with other African governments to essentially suppress the migration flow through sub-Saharan Africa, through North Africa into Europe.
Yeah, critics say paying the smugglers to keep them from...
And so basically that dead end at the southern shore of the Mediterranean means that all these migrants that were trying to come to Europe are blocked there. And so there was no mention of the EU's responsibility for certain circumstances that are contributing to the problem, or how they might recalibrate that policy in order to alleviate that problem.
One final question on this. Anita Moutet, there is that big Africa-Europe summit that took place in Abidjan. And it was interesting because Macron saying, look, I'm no longer the colonial master, but in a way, he's the interim king of Europe right now. The German chancellor was there, but she's bogged down back home in these coalition talks that we'll talk about in a minute. So does that mean that Macron had perhaps an outsized role at that summit, which is supposed to be a European Africa-Europe summit?
He has an outsized role because, yes, you said exactly, Trump is not somebody everybody can talk with. Some people do, but most of them don't. Angela Merkel is completely bogged down in this. He is brand Macron in so many ways. He comes as somebody who's both new, different, young, and powerful. So to some extent, he's probably right in taking the mantle because he probably can do something with it. And the fact that it is so different may also have ripples of reaction within the African publics. We've had all the white chiefs and they were all the same, and this one is really different. And he's telling us, take yourself in hand, and that might work out. There's no reason why he should keep on doing the same thing and not take the opportunity that he's got right now because of a number of factors, some due to who he is and his election, some others which are due to the change of balance in Europe.
Just one last quick point on Europe and Africa in particular. There's an interesting shift that's going on because France, because of its colonial history in Africa, usually was the European power in the EU that helped shape EU policy, especially in the region. Now, because of the impact of the migrant and refugee crisis, Italy, for instance, Greece, Germany, they have borne the brunt of that.
And Angela Merkel's gone to Africa to visit.
And so it's sort of rebalanced who's speaking for Europe and whose interests and who's setting the European agenda for how to deal with Africa. So it's a very interesting process of shifting and rebalancing that's going on right now.
Yeah, unless you're bogged down in coalition talks. After Abidjan, the German chancellor returning to the reality of perilous negotiations after the 11th hour pullout, you'll recall, of the liberal FDP party. Merkel and the country's president, well, twisting the arm a little bit of Social Democrat leader Martin Schulz, who after swearing he would never, ever, ever return to government as Merkel's junior coalition partner, well, now grudgingly contemplating another GroKo, as the Germans call it, a grand coalition. Or as the SPD leader puts it more precisely, he's not considering it.
Es gab eine breite Unterstützung dafür, in Bezug auf Regierungsbildung keine Optionen auszuschließen. Wir haben eine geschäftsführende Bundesregierung. Wir haben keinen Zeitdruck.
All right, they're saying that he's not considering it. And Elisabeth Boutet, what does your crystal ball tell you?
My crystal ball tells me that it seems it's almost impossible to be the party, big or small, that's going to cause another election in Germany, because what they're afraid of is seeing the Alternative for Deutschland, the extreme right-wing party, win even more votes, and that is probably what would happen. So, because some of Mrs. Merkel's electors might go to them. So the result is that as long as it was not going to happen with the FDP, the centrists, and the Greens together as two small parties next to the Chancellor, there was an opening for the SPD, the Socialist Party, and at the same time, Martin Schulz will not stay at the helm of the SPD if that fails. So he completely sort of crumbled during the elections. In the beginning, his polls were higher than Mrs. Merkel's, and then they went down, and he was seen as a completely uncharismatic figure. And voters in Germany were saying, no, we don't trust him. And so if he's not able of making this work, if he says, OK, we'll have a new election because I'm not able to do the political Schritt, the pace, that the initiative, then he's dead as head of the opposition as well. So he might as well do it.
So you're saying a majority of German politicians don't want a snap election. How about the German public? What does the German public want?
I think the German public they have lived in coalitions for the past 40 years at least. It's more normal in Germany to have a coalition government than not to have a coalition government. And so I suspect the German public doesn't actually want another snap election.
No.
Vivian Wald?
Yeah, I would think that that's probably right. I mean, we've been talking about these coalition talks for 2 months now, which is extraordinary. I mean, that's usually the way we talk about Belgium, not Germany. And there's really no end in sight. Now they're saying that perhaps this is going to continue until February. That's an long time not to have a government. Nonetheless, it seems hard to believe that most Germans would want to go through the election process again, exactly because you know, the threat of the far right gaining more ground in the Bundestag.
All right. Imagine there's no central bank. It's easy if you try. Actually, I'm not sure what John Lennon's take would have been on Bitcoin. It's hit another high above $10,500, recovering from an earlier dip. This after the U.S. derivatives regulator said it would be okay, the listing of Bitcoin futures. The virtual currency was worth all of 7 cents in 2010, shortly after its launch. And even though banks and most shops don't accept it, it's prompted comparisons, well, with past schemes gone wrong, going back to the Dutch tulip craze of 1637.
In, say, three years ago, Bitcoin was peanuts. You know, then when peanuts come to $1,000, it is not at all amazing that it goes from 1,000 to 7,000 or 10,000. Then there is a kind of explosion. Well, the question is duration of the explosion.
The ration of the explosion. I still don't understand what a Bitcoin is, Judah Grunstein.
It's a virtual currency. And the two impulses are to basically distribute the clearance process. So right now, if you write a check to someone, for instance, a bank is responsible for making sure you have the money in your account, transferring the money to the other account. And at the same time, the government regulates that. The government has visibility in that. It can all be followed. What Bitcoin does is that it distributes that clearance process to everyone in the network. And no one can actually see who the individual identities are. So accounts are verified, but it's in other words, it's opaque. There's no regulation, but there's also no government watching what you're spending your money on. So it's attracted people who have an interest in not having the government know what they're doing, but it's also attracted people who just by general principle don't like that. At the same time, it's a very complicated dynamic because what I learned many years ago from a good friend of mine who at the time was dealing in antique watches, and he showed me a very pricey collector's item, and he told me how much he was selling it for, and I said, but what's it worth? And he looked at me and he said, well, it's worth whatever someone is willing to pay me for it. So the idea that there's some sort of value is a collectively decided idea by who's willing to pay what for it on any given day.
Like Dutch tulips, but there's a difference in that. Right now, you have other cryptocurrencies, but they have the same disadvantages of the Bitcoin, which is that you don't have guarantees. But the American authorities have said that financial institutions can start their own cryptocurrencies. Now, unless you want to launder money, would you rather have a cryptocurrency from some established establishment, or would you rather have the Bitcoin? So it is under possible threat fairly soon. That's one thing. The other thing is that do not ask me how that works, but the mathematical algorithm means that once you reach a certain number of Bitcoin, they cannot produce any more. The algorithm cannot. Finite. It's finite for 21 million Bitcoin, and I'm not sure how many Bitcoin were in circulation. But it's going to reach the bubble point at some stage.
This is why it appeals to a lot of conspiracy theorists, a lot of gold bugs, because it's finite. And it's not what's known as a fiat currency. In other words, a government doesn't determine its value. Its value is determined by the marketplace. But similar to gold, for instance, gold has no actual intrinsic value besides a couple industrial uses, but even there, not many.
Yes, but you can find gold somewhere, usually in vaults, and presumably with the international man of mystery. But it does exist physically.
It certainly physically exists, but its value is
a final word.
Just that its rise has definitely been remarkable, but I don't see it transforming the economy. I mean, it still lags behind. If you think of if PayPal, for instance, or Google, mass market consumer technology, it doesn't even come close to it.
All right, we'll leave it there. It's still fascinating, though. Aaron Zaleski, I want to thank you. I want to thank Elisabeth Boutet, Judah Grunstein, Vivian Waltz. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
The scheming that we're talking about doesn't involve Bitcoin, but the White House.
No, absolutely. And a lot of people talking right now about quite what the implications are going to be for the Trump administration after the guilty plea of Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor. Only for 24 days, of course, it's probably worth remembering. Now, lots of people within the Trump administration and Michael Flynn Jr., Michael Flynn's son, have said it's all a big nothing burger about his links to Russia, which is why Anne Telnaes has portrayed Michael Flynn in the midst of a bun there, sitting on top of the tomatoes, because I don't think anyone right now can claim that this is a nothing burger.
An amazing chin, by the way.
Absolutely. She's even got him with the 5 o'clock shadow. He hasn't had time to shave.
Very good.
So, yes, without question, there is no brushing this under the carpet anymore. Seth Abramson has been tweeting all day about this. I think he's up to about number 78 in a thread. And this one says, any possibility that the Trump-Russia probe is, as Trump and his allies have long claimed, either a witch hunt or sour grapes or a nothing burger, this is all 100% real. Now, Politico have written a piece talking about the number of times that Donald Trump actually rode to his former advisor's defence, and this was all after he had been forced to resign. He talked about him being a wonderful man who'd been treated very, very unfairly by the media, and they also draw attention to this old tweet of Donald Trump's. Mike Flynn should ask for immunity in that this is a witch hunt excuse for big election loss by media and the Democrats of historic proportion. Now, the Daily Beast says that Donald Trump has of late started to worry about whether Flynn is going to flip, only in the last few weeks or so, apparently. But perhaps he should have been concerned a lot earlier than that, because if you remember back in March, the lawyer for Michael Flynn said, General Flynn certainly has a story to tell, and he very much wants to tell it. Now, according to ABC, they are reporting on this one. I don't know who their source is, but they are saying that Flynn is prepared to testify against President Trump and other members of his family and other staff in the White House. They say that Flynn will say that it was Donald Trump himself who ordered the contact with the Russians. So that would be hugely inflammatory and influential if that's the case. Now, according to ABC, Flynn is said to be distraught. He only decided in the last 24 hours that he was going to do this. And apparently, largely, it is because he is facing huge legal bills right now.
Huge legal bills. And by the way, has the Donald himself been tweeting?
Not at all. He's stayed very quiet indeed. And it's also worth noting that the White House cancelled an event where he could have faced questions from reporters. So they're very much keeping him quiet right now. This is really all we've heard is a statement. AFP boiling it down to this. The White House plays down Flynn's role within the Trump administration, describing him as an Obama official.
When in doubt, blame Obama.
Exactly. There used to be the phrase, thanks Obama. He was blamed for everything. Maggie Haberman from the New York Times says this is going to be White House strategy for as long as they can keep Trump from talking or tweeting about it. So it'll be interesting to see how long that lasts. Now, Vanity Fair is looking at whether or not Obama himself could be drawn into the Mueller investigation of those links to Russia, courtesy of this. And what they're citing is a meeting of 90 minutes, 2 days after the election, November the 10th.
I remember well, yeah.
Absolutely. Obama and Trump sat down, talked about world events, but interestingly, Michael Flynn was also one of the subjects, which does seem quite incredible with all the topics that they had to talk about. But he was already tipped as a potential national security advisor at that point. And according to
Flynn, who'd been
Obama,
fired by the Obama administration.
Yes, absolutely. He'd been forced out after 2 years. But an Obama insider who was briefed on this meeting says that Obama felt the position was so important that you really need a serious person in there, someone of higher caliber. They say it was less about possible corruption, more about competence, credibility and character. So there you go. Obama warned him, but he didn't take any notice.
All right, he didn't heed the warning. Many thanks, Emma. James, we're going to follow this story as it continues to break. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the World This Week.